Revolution of common sense.
Revolution of common sense.
A revolution of common sense.
Truth was once common sense, but today, truth is uncommon. Explore biblical truths around faith, business, and politics with Peter Demas. Uncommon sense in current times.
Hey folks, welcome to Uncommon Sense in Current Times. I'm so excited to be here with Dr. Carol Swain. Many of you have probably seen her on the news. She talks about a lot of different topics ranging from affirmative action. She wrote a book about the plagiarism scandals up at Harvard. She is a renowned political scientist, former Vanderbilt professor. Dr. Swain has just come out with a book called Diversity Without Discrimination, and we're really excited to talk to her about that today. So Dr. Swain, thank you so much for being on the show. I greatly appreciate you being here.
It's my pleasure. I'm very excited.
All right, so the subtitle, let's get into the subtitle first, because your subtitle is a little bit more on that. So tell me about that.
Well, this book, Diversity Without Discrimination, How to Promote a Culture of Unity in a Post-DEI Affirmative Action World. It is an expansion and an update of a book I published in 2023 titled The Adversity of Diversity, where I argued that the Supreme Court decision to strike down race-based affirmative action would spell the doom for affirmative action and DEI programs. So I actually predicted it in 2023 that affirmative action and DEI would die because the Supreme Court decision really pointed to something that I've known, many other Americans have known, and that's that DEI and affirmative action violates the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution. And many people that think about these issues or are aware of these issues, they believe that if you get rid of affirmative action, which President Trump has done by executive order, he's overturned 60 years of affirmative action. If you get rid of DEI, that you will have lily white institutions, that white men will rule the world. And that is mistaken. It's wrong. It wasn't true back 60 years ago, even though they were more dominant, but it's certainly not going to be true today and going forward that you would have lily white institutions. And I argue too that the belief that if you get rid of affirmative action, racial and ethnic minorities can't compete with white people, that's racist to the core.
So when affirmative action first came out, when the whole thing kind of started, did you feel at that time, or do you feel now, looking back at the history of it, that there was never a place for it, or did you feel, okay, at that moment in time there was one, but it quickly lost its luster? Like, where do you stand on that part of it?
People don't know the history of affirmative action, and I've taught courses on it. President Kennedy issued the first executive order instituting affirmative action in 1961. Back in 1961, we had not had a Civil Rights Act, and so there was rampant discrimination. And so when Kennedy issued his executive order in 1961, it was absolutely needed. In 1964, the culmination of the civil rights movement, we had the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed into law. And that Civil Rights Act prohibited discrimination on the basis of race, color, national origin, and sex. That was 64. A year later, President Lyndon Johnson gave a famous Howard University commencement speech where he used a metaphor of a shackled runner, and he argued that you do not take a shackled runner to the start of a race and say you're free to compete with everyone else and believe that you have been fair. And so at that point, 2 or 3 months after his Howard University commencement speech in 1965, Johnson issued an executive order instituting race-based and gender-based affirmative action, which we've had for 60 years. DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, and critical race theory, that grew out of that.
Did affirmative action, even in 1964, 1965, because I think when we see affirmative action now, we automatically put the word quotas to it. You know, there was this, you have to have a percent. Was it always quota base, or was it more of an encouragement to help those who might have different views and backgrounds?
Well, but, Peter, you asked me about affirmative action and whether or not it was needed back then.
Right.
In many ways, Johnson's executive order stepped on the Civil Rights Act of 1964 because we passed that to prohibit discrimination.
Right.
You look at that Civil Rights Act, some of the things it did was mandate that jobs had to be advertised nationwide. And that created opportunities for people that would not have known about these jobs. And the focus during my young adulthood and immediately after the passage of that law was outreach, equal opportunity. Doors opened up for people like me, but once we got our feet in, we had to compete with everyone else. And so some people made it, some people didn't. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is about guaranteeing outcomes. The focus is on equity, equal results, regardless of efforts. When the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed and the early stage affirmative action, there was a search for talented minorities, talented women and racial and ethnic minorities, and they were brought in, they were given an opportunity, they had to prove themselves, and the goal was integration. It was about assimilating. All of that changed.
So you move from this assimilation. You move from the goal of that to, again, the goal of equity. What do you think was the big change? Why do you think that shifted to that focus to where we're now seeing the DEI? Well, a couple of years ago, we were seeing DEI probably at the height of its strength and power.
Well, it was a gradual shift. And Richard Nixon, a Republican president, he was the one that instituted quotas through his Philadelphia plan. And my book, Diversity Without Discrimination, it gives the history of affirmative action and just how it morphed into diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I have called DEI affirmative action on steroids for a long time. And it totally became reverse discrimination against men, against white Americans, and against Christians, because the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was to prohibit discrimination based on sex. It was always seen as just protecting women. Back when I was a university professor at Princeton and at Vanderbilt, when you talk about civil rights, white people always assumed you were talking about minorities. They did not see themselves as having civil rights. Yet, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibited racial discrimination. It protected everyone. And what has happened is that the reverse discrimination got to the point that there was a lot of pushback, and it was so real that you couldn't deny it. And then white people started filing their own lawsuits to ensure protection of their rights, and they started winning some of those lawsuits. Men started winning lawsuits. And so that was the climate. The discrimination had gotten to the point, and then with the DEI, after George Floyd's death, it was like DEI was on steroids, and you had people that said, the most shocking things to people who were members of unprotected groups. If you were white, if you were a man, heterosexual, Christian, people who were members of protected groups and their allies acted as if they had a license to insult and say all kinds of hurtful words against people that were not in the protected groups. And so something had to be done And I think that's why the Supreme Court intervened. And in my book, The Adversity of Diversity, I anticipated the fall of affirmative action and DEI because my reasoning was if the Constitution's Equal Protection Clause means anything, and if the Civil Rights Act means anything, the Supreme Court had to strike down what was taking place. But the decision to end race-based college admissions left affirmative action in place, and Ronald Reagan left affirmative action in place. He could have issued an executive order overturning Johnson's executive order. He did not do that. Bush did not do that. Donald Trump did.
So you mentioned that happening through the judicial system. There were some lawsuits, et cetera. And I know that was huge, obviously, during the civil rights movement. I mean, Thurgood Marshall did an incredible job arguing on a lot of these cases and getting them before the U.S. Supreme Court. But I don't see that seem to have the big push to change things legislatively that it did originally through the civil rights movement. Why do you think that when white men were suing under the Civil Rights Act, it didn't seem to have the same steam or momentum that it did, say, in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s that it did in this country?
Well, I don't know that white men started suing until the 1970s when you had the Bakke case that involved a medical school, and you had cases in higher education where minority students were being admitted to professional schools as well as colleges and universities with scores that were grossly inferior to white students. White people complained of reverse discrimination, but mostly people laughed at them. The whole idea that a white person could be discriminated against. But that became so obvious, especially in the 1990s, it started being very obvious. In fact, Sandra Day O'Connor, in the cases known as the Michigan cases that had to do with college admissions, she said that in 25 years, she didn't think affirmative action would be needed. And so the court signaled back then that affirmative action would be eliminated. But the court decision in 2023 to stop race-based college admissions did not overturn affirmative action. The court did not touch that. That was not the question before the court. Affirmative action was instituted by executive order, and all it took was Donald J. Trump's courage to issue an executive order that overturned Johnson's executive order.
So how is it that you see in today's culture where we can have diversity without discrimination, but still promote levels of diversity? How do you see that occurring in today's climate and culture?
Well, one thing, we do have diversity at institutions and companies that have never been into diversity, equity, inclusion. They have just practiced non-discrimination. You can have naturally occurring diversity by just not discriminating. And the data shows that DEI and affirmative action never really worked. And if you look at the institutions of higher education, they have, and some of them have hundreds of DEI offices that they count as part of their diversity. And so they've set up different little silos where they bring in racial and ethnic minorities. They have them in Black studies, they have them in Hispanic studies, Asian studies, rather than a situation where you have people that come in and they just naturally go to certain departments. And I'm talking about academia, but even in the workplace, the problem has come from people that have decided that you had to have X number of executives, you had to have X number of people at different levels, and they move towards trying to create artificial quotas. When you do that, you don't hire the best and brightest, you don't end up with the best and brightest, and it even reinforces racism. Because if you put people in positions and they're not qualified for those positions, they're miserable and everyone around them suffer. And racial and ethnic minorities, most people don't know this, they never demanded preferential treatment. The civil rights movement was about non-discrimination and equal opportunity. And racial and ethnic minorities, one of the people that I love quite a bit is Bob Woodson of the Woodson Center. He's 84 years old. He's old school Black, and he has tons of data on Black success stories coming out of slavery, people who became millionaires that had been slaves through their own intellect and ingenuity. Look at Booker T. Washington and the Tuskegee Institute. And there's data from Blacks in higher education that the colleges and universities that did not discriminate against Blacks, and many of them were in New England, they have had Black alumni going back, to 1800s. And then with Harvard University, Harvard has done all this stuff, apologizing for slavery. I believe they graduated their first Black student in 1871. W.E.B. Du Bois got his PhD, I believe, in 1930. But they have always admitted qualified minorities. And I would say the same for most of the Ivy League schools, not all of them. There's a story at Princeton where someone, Paul Robeson, I guess, showed up at Princeton. He was qualified and he got turned away because he was Black. But for the most part, any place that did not discriminate would have some diversity. And the Black middle class in Washington, D.C., the ones that are the wealthiest ones, they were able to do this because of the civil service test. At one time, if you had the highest score, you got the job. And it took out all the subjective opportunities to discriminate based on the test scores. Blacks love that. And so you can have diversity without discrimination, but you end up with a situation where you have mutual respect, where people working together as part of a team, that the weakest link on the team is not associated with a particular gender or a particular race.
Do you think do you think there is now becoming a backlash from younger white men who have seen people get up that aren't qualified, and can reinforce stereotypes that they may have, or they feel like they have been discriminated against whether they haven't or not because they've heard a lot of rhetoric around it? Do you think there has been a backlash that could also create problems in this next level of diversity without DEI?
I mean, it's over. They won.
Okay.
The white males that were working class and middle class, because if you were white and wealthy, you didn't suffer. We had the expression limousine liberals, because the limousine liberals, they sent their kids to private schools, and then they wanted, everyone else's kid to be in public schools and to be in a particular situation. The only whites that have suffered the most have been the working class and the poor ones that were not connected, not well connected. And it did create resentment. And I think we're going to have unity and better relationships across racial and ethnic groups now that this change has taken place. But Rita, what I have found is that it hasn't sunk in to most people. The average American may understand at some level that President Trump signed an executive order, he got rid of DEI, but it hasn't sunk in that he got rid of 60 years of affirmative action. And I don't think that anyone knows what that means for all these affirmative action offices across the country. I know that we do have a need for the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission, or there has to be a monitoring agency where you can report discrimination. Employers and employees need to know that discrimination is prohibited by the law. So there are laws that have to be adhered to. But as far as preferential treatment for women, for members of the LGBTQT community, and racial and ethnic minorities, that is over. It's dying. It's in its death throes. that's not widely known. And so my book, Diversity Without Discrimination, How to Promote a Culture of Unity in a Post DEI Affirmative Action World, it talks about that. It also talks about a company that I founded in 2020 called Real Unity Training Solutions. And the goal of that company was to provide an alternative to the DEI and the race training to get back to the idea of the national motto, E pluribus unum, out of many one, and to get companies back on mission. Because what DEI and affirmative action and critical race theory did was to take companies away from their mission, and it really worked up employees. It created a lot of divisiveness, and sometimes companies lost their most talented workers because they forced the employees to sit there, and if they were white and if they were male, they sat there and they were berated for for a few
Mhm.
hours, and that just created a lot of resentment. And then with the racial and ethnic minorities, a lot of them were fine; they were happy on the job. Then came in the diversity trainer and told them that they were a victim, they were being oppressed, they were being held back. And so all of a sudden, your happy minority employees were not so happy. And the idea of real unity training is to just get back to building healthy teams, treating everyone with equal respect, applying the golden rule, and and getting everyone on mission around the vision of the person who founded the organization.
So when I look at and I think and I go back to book by Pivot and Cloward, Regulating the Poor,
Yes.
and talking about kind of this cycle of poverty that occurred. I look now and I look at a large percentage of the black population are raised with homes without fathers. I think
Right.
1 in 3 is one number I've heard. 1 in 4 is another that I've heard, where they have black fathers there. We see a idea in the culture that has been put in there for many years. So much of the generations that are here have had this culture that they are victims that are happening. So now we eliminate this. Do you think because they have the mental, they've almost put themselves in a mental slavery without any hope of anyone in their own family to get them through, that they have a hope of being able to break through to find this diversity without that basic there?
Peter, people have broken through from generations out of the inner cities. There's always one in every family, no matter what the culture of that family. And those ideas that have held Black people back and other groups, they're progressive ideas. And if you dig deep enough, you get to cultural Marxism, which
Mhm.
is an outgrowth of economic Marxism and Karl Marx. And the whole idea was to disrupt the institutions, disrupt the family, disrupt the church, disrupt the government. It was all about destroying institutions. It never offered a solution. And I think a lot of the chaos that's happened with Black families came about because of the turbulent 1960s, when the Marxists had been in the country long enough to really start training students and to create all the unrest that we saw. And many things happened in the 1960s. We saw prayer being ousted from
Mhm.
schools, from public schools. We saw the Supreme Court rule against Bible reading in school. We saw the rise of no fault divorce, and all of these social movements, the environmentalist movement, the women's movement, the gay rights movement, the Black movement, all of these movements took place during the 1960s, and it was all about groups, group rights, conflict. And those people who thought that DEI and sensitivity training was going to bring about racial unity, it was never intended to bring about unity. You cannot bring unity out of chaos or out of conflict. There's no reconciliation that will come from that. And so when you look at racial and ethnic minorities before the 1960s, and certainly the period that followed slavery, their family structure looked pretty similar to white family structures.
Mhm.
That started to change. By 1965, 25% of Black households were headed by women, 25%. Today, it's probably over 70%. But Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was a New York senator and a Harvard professor, he tried to warn about the dangerous pattern that was emerging in the Black family. And what did the progressives do? They came to the defense of the dysfunction and argued that the European model of mom, dad, and biological children was just one form of family, and that there were other forms of family that were equally acceptable. The crime rate, out of control crime rate in the Black community, that was not the case in the 40s and in the 50s, and even parts of the 60s. In the 60s was when we got the urban riots. But for Black America, things have only worsened because of the progressives. And we have some good news. And the good news is that starting with Black men, I guess in 2020, and before, you saw them moving away from progressive politics and from the Democratic Party. And now you see the conservative policies of a candidate like Donald Trump, who's a Republican. You see more racial and ethnic minorities getting on board. In fact, a majority of Americans got on board. And it's because they knew the country was headed in the wrong direction. Today, the data shows that 40% of Americans believe the country is headed in the right direction. And so I think that we have reasons to be encouraged. But what I want to encourage people with is that we should celebrate the end of DEI and affirmative action, because it gives us an opportunity to build true unity.
So is there is the answer to the checks of people taking advantage of it? Take like the Varsity Blues scandal. They were, they used their power, influence, et cetera, to get their children scholarships and get them into certain schools without qualified for it. Where do you see the checks and balances? Do you maintain it's still the EEOC? Is the area there, or should there be other checks and balances to ensure
I
that
don't know
fairness
how
happens?
common that type of thing is, because usually with rich people, all they have to do is pick up the phone and call someone, and that's how they get their kids in.
Right.
What's wrong with those people that use the system where they got caught? This has always been going on, but it doesn't work for people that are working class and poor. They're
Right.
not part of the old boy, old girls network where you pick up the phone and you call someone important.
So you mentioned earlier, though, you talked about the EEOC. It's very important we have a very strong EEOC to ensure that people are not being discriminated against. With this
Yeah.
change, why do you think that there's still going to be racist tendencies from employers from that when we're looking for the best and brightest?
Well, I just think that human nature is human nature, and it may not be the CEO or all the employees. All you need is just one supervisor that discriminates. And the people who are victims need to have a place to go. And when I see the role of EEOC in the future, it's going to be defending the rights of all Americans. So it's not going to be the place where racial and ethnic minorities and women go, to get support or to get their cases evaluated, but it's there for everyone. And one of the things that the progressives sort of misled or distracted people with was this whole idea of a microaggression, which is a perceived insult. And I know some HR directors who have brought in experts to interview employees. And when they sat down with those people who were claiming to be discriminated against, what they described was not discrimination, it was perceived slights. And so people that are actually being discriminated against, they need to have a place to go. But at the same time, a lot of what passes as discrimination today is not actually discrimination.
I was talking to a friend of mine this morning who is a psychologist, and he said he hears more and more of the three T's: toxic, trauma, and triggered. He's like, I hear that all the time now. That again, that has to work out through the system. That's not something that can change overnight by an executive order. So when we're considering that, where do you see as kind of the biggest hope for changing it in the culture after the executive order goes in place? Because again, we have to change internally and
And
culturally.
right. And I hope my book, Diversity Without Discrimination, is a step in the right direction for companies. But there's going to be some growing pains. It's going to take a while because right now, a huge percentage of the population is not even aware that anything changed and something has changed. And so I think that it's going to take a while. And then in Washington, D.C., for example, where jobs are being eliminated, thousands of jobs are being eliminated, well, unemployment will grow up, will increase because these people are given severance packages. They will start looking for jobs again. And so there's going to be growing pains. It's going to take a while for everything to settle. And I think that we did not get into this situation overnight. It's not going to be resolved overnight. And so people just need to sit tight, reserve judgment, watch, and listen,
Right.
give it time. And I think we're going to end up much stronger than we've ever been before as a nation, and that we can have unity, and we will have unity because we're removing some of the sources of conflict that were put in place to tear us apart.
So for those of you who want to buy this book, like where do they go to get your book and know more about understanding more about diversity without discrimination?
So the book can be purchased from all major booksellers. Locally in Middle Tennessee, Logos Books carries the book, and I personalize the ones that Logos signs, and they can be ordered, through my website. So there are any number of places where books can be purchased.
All right. Well, Dr. Swain, I thank you so much for coming onto the show. I greatly appreciate it. I appreciate all this information, and I love the hope you have going forward. And I pray that our country embraces this so that we can end a lot of the discrimination that is occurring here.
All right. Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you.